Let's get started. 2020 is a very special year. Not only are we going through an unprecedented crisis due to the pandemic caused by COVID-19, but also we're trying to figure out a new path to the globalized future. To imagine the future, we need to remember the past. For we, as Americans and as Chinese, once lived through difficult moments like this together. Today, let's revisit the stories of a prison camp in wartime China. 79 years ago, when the United States entered the war in the Pacific, Western civilians living in China were rounded up and imprisoned by the Japanese until the end of the war. The prison camp in Weihsien, Shandong Province was one of the largest. The camp is called Le Dao Yuan, which literally means the courtyard of the Happy Way. Isn't something impressive? The food was scarce, living conditions harsh, and rescue uncertain. The prisoners in the camp survived the difficult times and exhibited amazing human resilience, creativity, and heroism in facing of oppression. Today, through this special online event, we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And we remember the forgotten histories from the Le Dao Yuan. We have speakers from all the world who are the witness of history and are here to share their lived experiences with us. But before that, it is our great honor to have Professor Steve MacKinnon to give us a keynote speech to jumpstart the program. Steve MacKinnon is a professor of Chinese history and politics at Arizona State University. He was trained in Chinese language and history at Yale University, California University of Davis, and over the decades of his career of being a China scholar, Professor MacKinnon has published dozens of academic articles, book chapters. He also authors several monographies for specialists, such as Power and Politics in Late Medieval China, Wuhan, 1938, War, Refugees, and the Making of Modern China. His celebrated works, such as China Reporting, an oral history of American journalists in China during 1930s and 1940s, and Angus Smedley, The Life and Times of American Radical, are reviewed in New York Times and have a huge impact on our understanding of war and journalism in China. Professor MacKinnon recently finished another book, can you believe that? Right? Tentatively titled China's Last Revolutionary Romantic, Life and Times of Chen Hansheng. Upon recent update, I believe the book will be published by the Chinese University of Hong Kong Press next year. Professor MacKinnon is a highly respected scholar in the field of China studies, and he has decades-long experiences with China. He taught in China on many occasions since the 1970s and has been visiting scholars at numerous institutions. In Arizona, he's a founding member of the Finnish Committee of Foreign Relations, sister cities with China, Asia Arts Council of Finnish Art Museum, and so forth and so on. If I'm not mistaken, Professor MacKinnon also has his DC connection. His daughter, Rebecca, is a founding director of a ranking digital rights program at the New America Foundation in town, after serving 5 years in China as a CNN bureau chief. As a very well-established scholar in China studies and Sino-American relations, Professor MacKinnon today will give us a keynote speech as an introduction to the historical background of a Weihsien Prison Camp. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Steve MacKinnon. It's yours.
Thank you, Xin, for the generous introduction. And I'm flattered to be asked to participate in this symposium on the Weihsien World War II prison camp. My role, I think, here is to provide a little background. The anti-Japanese war, or war of resistance as the Chinese call it, changed China forever. Historians and the Chinese public differ over even when the war started. Was it in 1931 when the Japanese invasion and occupation of Manchuria happened, or the bombing of Shanghai? Or was it later when Chiang Kai-shek formally declared war in July 1937? Most of the fighting on the Chinese side was done by nationalist troops under the loose overall command of Chiang Kai-shek. Communist troops, relatively small in number, operated as guerrillas in isolated areas of the Northwest. At the minimum, there was 8 years of total war and devastation. It turned half the population into refugees and killed uncounted millions of soldiers, with famine and disease taking even more civilian lives. Everywhere, there were orphan children left to wander in cities and villages across China. Then suddenly the war ended in August 1945, with Japanese soldiers in place in the most populated parts of coastal China, including, of course, Weihsien in Shandong Province. But what about the diverse, sizable foreign population resident in China during the 1920s and 30s? Business people, journalists, academics, many with their families, Protestant missionaries, Catholic priests and nuns. There was even a thriving bohemian community of Western artists and writers. They were there hanging out because China was cheap, an unregulated haven for eccentric foreigners. In the 1930s, the foreign population of China was privileged, or they thought they were, enjoying treaty port protections from the extraterritoriality system, the system that dated back to the Opium Wars of the 1840s and 1850s. After total war was declared in 1937, this expat community still considered themselves beyond the reach of occupying authorities, since none of their home countries were at war with the Japanese. In retrospect, this was a rather naive view. There was a minority within the foreign community who were horrified by the Nanjing massacre of 1938-38, excuse me, and were sympathetic enough to the Chinese cause to pull up stakes and retreat behind the lines into the interior, where free China was holding out. Others simply left China altogether. Nevertheless, at the time of Pearl Harbor, surprise attack in December 41, of course, there was still a significant foreign community residing in China's major coastal cities. Quickly, the Japanese rounded up the expat community and placed them in camps. The Weihsien missionary compound, which is roughly 12 acres, I think, on the Shandong coast, held 1,500 to 2,000 foreigners, from many of whom, most all of whom were really from North China, the largest number from Peking and Tianjin. There was also a big camp just outside of Shanghai that Steven Spielberg dramatized in the movie Empire of the Sun, if you remember that. In South China, with the sudden fall of Hong Kong by Christmas 1941, the large expat community there was caught flatfoot, was rounded up and jammed into an existing prison at Stanley on the tip of Hong Kong Island. Conditions were terrible, as will be described by others, but they were nothing like the bridge of the River Kwai or the Bataan death marches of captured Allied troops in Burma, or the treatment of members of the Chinese population when they were arrested by Japanese authorities. Again, there's a wonderful movie by Ang Lee, you may remember, Lust, Caution. How about American reaction to the anti-Japanese war? More specifically, what was the reaction of the Chinese diaspora in the US and elsewhere? The US politicians in 1937 were in a deeply isolationist mode, using the slogan, ironically enough, America first. Have you heard that before? So this was an obstacle, but at the popular level, there was a growing groundswell of sympathy for the Chinese cause, led in part by Henry Luce of the Time Life publications, and they were hugely influential at the time. Luce was a missionary kid in China, born in Chufu in Shandong Province, called Yantai today, rather famous now for its red wine. And there were returned missionaries like Logan Roots or the medical missionary Walter Judd, who by the late 1930s was elected to Congress from Minnesota. Judd was a fervent supporter of the Chinese cause on the media in the US at that time, radio, also in Congress. The missionary daughter Pearl Buck and the well-known novelist Lin Yutang, their books were immensely popular in the 1930s. In 1938, Buck, including, of course, The Good Earth, her most famous novel, made into an Academy Award movie. Anyway, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature in that year, 1938. Chinese Americans from Hawaii to New York became increasingly involved in raising money for medical supplies through organizations like the China Relief Fund and volunteering to work for the Chinese Red Cross. They were big supporters of what was called the Gung Ho or Gung He and Duscos, thousands of small industrial cooperatives operating near the front, producing small arms, munitions, medical supplies, and such. Personifying support for the Chinese cause, of course, was Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek. The Zhangs, in fact, were named Time, Man, and Wife of the Year in 1937. Their popularity amongst Chinese Americans was huge, including student groups. At that time, they were not yet divided between pro or anti-communist camps. Madame Zhang, who was a Wellesley graduate, you probably know, made well-publicized trips to the US, addressing joint sessions of Congress, I think at least twice after Pearl Harbor, and meeting with Chinese American groups regularly from coast to coast. There was also General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, the American commander for the China Theater from 1942 to 44. Although eventually controversial because of his clashes with Chiang Kai-shek, he, along with General Claire Chennault of the Flying Tigers, were fervent supporters of the Chinese cause. Stilwell had important Chinese American top aides working with him throughout the military campaigns in China, in Burma, and elsewhere. One such figure was Captain Richard Young, who was from Hawaii and was an old friend of mine. Chennault ultimately married a prominent Chinese journalist figure connected to the nationalist leadership in the person of Anna Chennault, or Chen Xianmei. There was a 1941 Hollywood movie called Kugan about the Chinese resistance, military and otherwise. It was directed by a Chinese American team led by Li Ling-ai from Hawaii and has been revived recently and made available by Robin Leung. One figure from the Chinese diaspora you may not have heard of, who received a great deal of publicity and support at the time from the American public and the Chinese community, Chinese American community, was Robert K. Lim. Lim, or Lin Kesheng, was from a wealthy Singapore family with a UK and University of Chicago medical degrees. He had been teaching and working at the Rockefeller-funded Peking Union Hospital and College since the early 1930s. Lin was charismatic, a great organizer and fundraiser with a focus on the global diaspora. Once total war was declared and coastal China was lost, Lin moved to Chongqing. Then Changsha, also operating Changsha, Kunming, Guiyang in southwest China. And he concentrated on organizing small paramedic units in support of Chinese troops. By 1939, he was head of the Chinese Red Cross formally and turned it into a major organization. In fact, this is the ancestor of the Chinese Red Cross in the PRC and in Taiwan today. Money for vehicles and supplies poured in internationally in support of Lin's efforts from Southeast Asia, North America, and so forth. Journalists like Agnes Smedley and Newsreel Wong wrote about and photographed Lin in action for the American public. Backed by Chiang Kai-shek's government in Chongqing, Lin also worked with Madame Sun Ching-ling in Hong Kong and even the communists who were based in Yan'an. The British, American, and Soviet ambassadors in Chongqing supported his effort. And after 1941, with the fall of Hong Kong, Lin led the Red Cross efforts behind the lines and became an official in the Ministry of Health. Briefly after the war, he was Chiang Kai-shek's Surgeon General. And ultimately, after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Lin moved to the US. He became an American citizen and lived in Indiana doing important work in the pharmaceutical industry. He died in 1969. Well, I could go on, but I think my time is running out. We are here to focus on specific conditions and the experience in the prison camp at Weihsien. Ironically enough, that area had been, since the 1920s, a popular vacation and playground by the sea for the expat population of North China. Well, thank you. And who's next?
That would be me. Thank you, Professor MacKinnon, for laying the scene for us, as it were, during the start of the Pacific War. My name is Louisa Sorkness. I am the program coordinator here at the Chinese American Museum in Washington, D.C., where I am sitting right now. And next, I have the great pleasure of introducing 3 former internees from the Weihsien Prison Camp. Before I start chatting with them, though, I would like to acknowledge a member of our audience here today who was also a prisoner in the camp, Solange Binda McLean, known during her time at Weihsien as Jacqueline de Saint-Hubert. I would like to share a screen of her. Jacqueline was 20 years old when she, along with her parents and brother, all Belgian nationals, were imprisoned at Weihsien. She remembers they were among the earliest to be interned, the Japanese confiscating their Tientsin home, the armbands, her parents scrambling to leave possessions with Russian and Chinese friends, her needing to leave her beloved dog behind and walking through the streets of Tientsin to this train station with a few possessions that they could carry, frightened and unknown of the future. She recalls how the local Chinese residents were cheering for them and wishing them good fortune. Jacqueline is an artist in every sense of the word. Though while in camp, uncertainty was high, Jacqueline found comfort in her art, from capturing the grounds of what in watercolor paintings to organizing and participating in opera and dance theater productions. Her passion for the arts has driven her throughout life. After the war, moving to the United States, she started her first ballet school in 1949. Shortly after, she founded the Ballet Academy of Northern Virginia and enjoyed a flourishing career for over 6 decades. Even today, Jacqueline teaches a ballet online Zoom class once a week. And thanks, Jacqueline. We're really happy you were able to join us today. I also want to encourage everyone at this time to, if you have questions for any of the panelists throughout our talk, please put them in the question and answer tab you will find at the bottom in the chat section. And with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Leopold Pander. Excuse my lack of French accent. Leopold is joining us today from his home in Belgium, where he lives in a small village south of Brussels, along with his wife. Before retirement, Leopold enjoyed an adventurous career as a merchant sailor, followed by a shift in career to electronic wholesale, different kind of sale. You could say, in a way, it is thanks to Leopold that we are all here today. Leopold is the creator and master web designer of WeixianPaintings.org, a vast depth of knowledge, documentation, and archiving of shared stories and memories from Weihsien Prison Camp. It is thanks to his tireless efforts and diligence in bringing this community together that these stories have stayed alive and allowed this network to keep in contact with one another. Thanks for being here, Leopold.
My pleasure.
So as Belgian nationals, you were just a toddler when you and your family were imprisoned in the camp. So let's just jump right into have a little bit of understanding of what the camp was like. Once your family was imprisoned, how were the living quarters and how was the camp divided? Was it divided into nationalities, families versus individuals? What was the situation?
Well, I don't remember much about Weihsien. I was a baby.
Mm-hmm.
All I know comes from the website. So I know we had small rooms of 9 foot on 12, and we had to live in those small spaces. Our family of 4 had 2 rooms in block 22, and we managed there. I don't remember anything, I'm sorry. But for the répartition of the nationalities, everything was mixed. So everybody was mixed. There was no problem. I don't know of any religious problems, nationality problems. Everything went cool.
Okay, so as another broad stroke understanding of the camp, how was it organized under the Japanese authority?
So the Japanese didn't want to do too much. So they told us, I wrote that on the paper, they told us that we had to have a responsible person for different sections of the camp. And they said that we had to have, sorry for my English, I had French.
No problem.
So we had to have des représentants for general affairs, discipline, labor, education, supplies, quarters, medicine, engineering, and finance. Those people were responsible to the Japanese, and the Japanese organized the camp. So we had the food that came from the exterior of the camp, and we had to do all the rest ourselves. So the whole organization of the camp was done by the prisoners.
So if I understand it correctly, the prisoners organized themselves into committees, right, and they manage different sections of camp life overseen by the Japanese.
Correct.
Yes.
All the Japanese did was to keep us inside the camp with searchlights, machine guns, Arica rifles, and that was all they did. We had 2 roll calls a day to see if everybody was present, children included, and that was our life in camp.
And how did the prisoners determine their leadership?
The leadership was organized democratically, like we do now in our countries. And every 6 months, we had an election where the responsible persons for the committee were chosen. So that was absolutely free. The Japanese didn't want to have anything to do with that.
So it sounds like the prisoners had a pretty general responsibility of taking care of themselves and making sure camp life went smoothly. You mentioned that there was a sense of gathering, and I have a sense that there was a bit of a black market that was involved in the camp. Can you tell, I know that you have a great personal story about your father using that black market system. Could you tell us about that?
Well, my father did black market as everybody else did. Such was life, because the food was awful. We didn't have much, and we had to do business with the Chinese outside the camp to have food.
And then when your sister was born, he was able to use it in another aspect.
Well, that is a story. It's just, my parents like to talk about it, because when my little sister was born in July 1944, Europe was just liberated. We didn't know that, of course. But my little sister was born, and Dad wanted to absolutely to let his family in Belgium know the good news. But how to do that? Well, he had a great friend, Father de Jager, who was very keen with the Chinese from the outside, because his main job was the latrines, the cesspool. He had connections with the cesspool coolies. You know what the cesspool is? It's just a great hole in the ground with all this smelly stuff that smelled awful, you know.
Yep.
And everything went into that hole that was open to the open air. And Father Jager said, well, you put your message in a box, you put a bit money for the stamp, you put a little bit more money for the service, you close the box, and you throw it into the cesspool. And we did that. And finally, after the war, well, we had the confirmation of the family in Belgium that they received a telegram to say that my little sister was born and she was well, and the mother too. That's the story.
Yeah, well, resourcefulness, I think that is an overarching theme of everyone who went through this experience. If you could briefly just tell us, you were only 4 years old when the camp was liberated, and so many years later, you had developed this amazing website, which we have gleaned all of our information concerning Weihsien from. What inspired you so many years later to start this compilation?
Well, first of all, curiosity. That was 20 years ago. Computing was not so developed as it is now. And I was curious to know how it worked. So when my boss decided to sell his business, I bought a computer and found out how to use it. And from there on, I tried to find out a little bit more about Weihsien. If I found a website about Weihsien, there was a conversation list. I joined that. And then a certain day, I wanted to share painting reproductions with the other members of the group. And I didn't know how to do that. So I asked, and I had the opportunity of sending it on a website. Well, at that moment, the website didn't exist. Now we call it a blog. So I sent a few pictures, and the people who received it said it would be a good idea. And they sent me their documents, pictures, photos, and so on. And from there on, it is an infinite succession of opportunities. And finally, well, the website is as it is now.
Yeah, grown and grown. And, I know just from speaking to some of the members of that community, everyone's so grateful and thankful for your efforts in putting this together. I wish we could keep talking, Leopold, because there's so much more, but again, we do need to keep this party moving a little bit. So at that, I'm now going to, thanks for the chat. We'll talk to you again in a little bit, Leopold. I'm now going to introduce Angela Elliott. Angela is joining us from Vancouver, Canada. She was actually born in Weihsien Prison Camp. She spent her childhood mostly in China and Hong Kong, and then finally her family was able to move to Canada, where she resides today. With always the desire to travel, Angela enjoyed a career in Canadian Pacific Airlines, which is now Air Canada. Angela has been able to return to Tientsin quite often with her husband and enjoys visiting her daughter and grandson in Seattle, Washington. Thanks for being with us, Angela.
Are you able to hear me?
Hi, Angela. Yes, we can. Thanks for joining us. Thank you. And Angela, could you tell us just a little bit to get started about your family and how it came that they were in China during World War II? I think it goes all the way back to your great-grandfather.
Yes, one great-grandfather and a British other paternal grandfather and Chinese grandmother. So my parents are both born in China, and so was I at that time. So our family was long established there already. Mm-hmm.
So once no, please go ahead.
Sorry. No, sorry. Please continue.
Okay, so once your family was put into the camp, I mean, tensions were very high, and adults and children alike. And I think it's very fascinating to me, and this is something I've thought about a lot, is just how the adults kept a sense of normalcy and reassurance to the children throughout this time while they were under such high tensions as well. Can you speak to some of the things that the kids were able to do and the way that the parents were able to help them through it?
Well, I think a lot of people were certainly worried about the future, what would happen, whether when it would end, would it ever end? But at the same time, they had to carry on as best they could, especially in the interest of the children. And I think there was some sort of normalcy. People just took it in their stride after a time. Things went fairly well. Schools were held, classes were held for the children. The Chifu boarders that came from their school, of course, had their own teachers and that type of thing. But the rest of the children from Tientsin and otherwise attended a different school, and they tried to instruct the children as normally, although supplies were low, and having sporting events and this type of thing. So I think that after a while, people just got used to it and didn't want to think past that, just hope that one day it would all end.
Yeah, because so it was not only just families as full units that were taken to the camp. There was also, among other examples too, but this boarding school in Chifu of these children who were brought to the camp with their teachers. So they were many were separated from their parents for the entire time that they were in camp.
Well, their parents, again, most of them were in remote areas in China or areas where it did not have any English schooling. And so they went to the Chifu boarding school, but they were in turn there for quite a length of time before they all came to Weihsien. And again, most of them didn't see their parents for almost 5 years. Mind you, their teachers were fantastic from what's been written, instructed them, and of course with a very religious background as well, which helped. And the children did well. They passed their exams and this type of thing. They wrote their exams. They were sent to England after, and they qualified. So really, there was a lot of effort on the part of the adults, and it certainly worked out well for everybody.
Yeah, such a testimony to all the adults under such an amount of stress on their own, making sure that this didn't draw back their children in any way. They were still able to excel in their academics. They still had it, in all intents and purposes, a childhood.
Yeah, the camp was really run very well. Of course, there were different arguments and this type of thing. That always goes on. But overall, the committees worked well and people did their volunteer work and this type of thing. And also they were creative. They had musical concerts, performances. Jacqueline, I understand, was in certain performances to dance, and another girl, Betty Lambert, was a dancer as well, who studied, I think, with the same teacher for ballet that Jacqueline did. And there were dances for the adults as well, and many operettas and plays and this type of thing. So people were able to have some amusement.
Yeah.
They improvised along the way for costumes and this type of thing, and people really excelled in that, just to keep their minds off where they were and why they were there and what would happen to them.
Sure. Yeah, there was always the factor of the unknown, just trying to continue life and have fun in it as well, but there was always the uncertainty and stress of the unknown and what was going to happen next.
Well, exactly. A lot of people feared for the worst and really and thought that we'd all be gunned down at the end and executed when the Japanese lost the war, but luckily we weren't.
Yeah, thank God. So Angela, we do need to move on. Again, I'm going to continue to say this. I wish we could keep talking, but thank you for your time today, and thanks for joining us. And we'll bring you back in a little later for some of the question and answers.
Thank you.
Thank you. So moving right along, next up, allow me to introduce Molly Soltay, zooming in with us today from outside of Toronto, Canada. Molly has enjoyed living all over the world and back again, from China to Switzerland, a successful fashion design career in Hong Kong, once married, moving to Saudi Arabia, running an illegal kindergarten, back to Hong Kong with many other stops along the way, all while dragging 2 daughters along for the ride. Molly and her husband, Leslie, retired in Canada outside of Toronto, where they are still always up for the next adventure. Thanks for making the time for us today, Molly.
You're welcome.
Great. Molly, could you briefly also tell us about your family background and how they ended up in China?
Well, my father was British by virtue of birth. He was from a Eurasian mother and a Norwegian father. And he eventually went from Hong Kong, where he was born, to Shanghai. And then he went to Mukden. And in Harbin, he met my mother, who was running away from the Bolsheviks and was Russian. And contrary to popular belief, not all Russians are prostitutes. Many of them were actually very well placed in life. They married, and then they went to Tianjin, where my father worked for the American company Texaco. You want their names?
Sure. I mean, yeah, just whatever you'd like to share.
Well, my father's name was Francis Foyne, and my mother's maiden name was actually, mouthful, Igonova Vasenin, and even longer, but we won't go into it.
Okay. So I know that your mother, something you had told me previously was that your mother was an extremely resourceful woman, had a very get up and go attitude. She also, I mean, running from the Bolsheviks, having to pick up quickly and move her life circumstances was not a brand new activity. So with your mother's get up and go attitude, can you tell us some of the stories of her resourcefulness that she was able to tap into at camp?
Well, unlike Leopold, I digested and lived through the World War and the camp life for 16 years, probably 3 times a week with dinners with ex-camp people, which always started with, remember those good old days in camp. And they evidently were some interesting days, and I've digested it all, and I've got reams of stories. My mother, when she arrived in camp, one of the things she started was to make a garden. She brought seeds with her. It was springtime, and a lot of the European women actually had seeds, so they shared the implements. My mother brought a lot of gardening tools, and she got her neighbors all organized. In fact, she even won a prize for the best garden. They needed the carrots and the onions and the potatoes and the beans to live on. And that was one way of doing it. My mother was also, being Russian, they loved to socialize. So one of the best things they ever did was whatever they could get a hold of, they used to make moonshine, you would call it, a thing called kvass, made out of old fruit and brown bread, and it was fermented. But they were not the only people that did that. I gather a lot of the Europeans did their own little thing, some successful, some terribly wrong. But they had to keep going. They had to do something outside of the day-to-day manual labor, keeping alive, keeping their stomachs from growling. So they did all those things to keep themselves going.
Can you tell us? Yeah, please go ahead.
My father ventured into using my mother's meat grinder to do peanut butter. We had a great talk on peanut butter at our website, and he ground peanut butter. He ground it for other people. He loaned out the peanut butter grinder, and it was something one did, you know, to live. And the black market was great on peanut butter. China had so much peanuts.
Yeah, so I know your father had a story from the black market. Can you tell us about one of his experiences in the black market?
Well,
I think he was looking for some eggs.
yeah, my father decided, since my mother was pregnant, that he needed to get some eggs for her and get the eggshells for calcium. So he managed to crawl somewhere near, goodness knows where, got a handful of eggs, heard the soldiers coming by, hid the eggs. They found him. They knew he was going either to the wall or back from it. They didn't see anything. They beat him and left him. He was able to take the eggs back home. And that was a good thing.
Yeah. Not to go too dark here, but just because I'm sure a lot of people are curious. This was a prison camp. What was the excess of punishment like within the camp?
One of the favorite things they used to do, and I'm sure Leopold's mother went through that too. A pregnant woman with a large belly was poked with a bayonet at the butt, or they were kicked, and it was sort of, what have you got there? And that was one of their favorite little tricks, and they would go away laughing. My mother didn't laugh too much, but after a while she used to say, well, that's why you're so dumb. I can tell you about the food they ate. I'm sure Leopold would love that. I think he might remember. Donkey. They brought in some donkeys, or a donkey, and it was riddled with grubs. And they said, ooh, it's really rotten. The doctor said, no, you keep the grubs. They've got nutrition value. You cook with it. They did eat it for what it was worth, but they said it was interesting.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. So there was gardening, there was resourcefulness through the black market, peanut butter making, and so were these donkeys with rotting meat, were those what the food was like that was actually provided by the Japanese?
It was sporadic depending on what they could get, how they could get it, how fresh or how rotten it was. And my father was in the one of the kitchens, and he was stoking the stove, which was a fairly interesting job. In winter, warm, and summer, hot. But, that was one of the things they did. And it was absolutely something that they did. And because my father spoke multiple Chinese dialects, and everybody spoke multiple languages, he was able to talk to the black marketeering and made actually quite good friends with some of the locals. And it was interesting. He always wanted to go back and see them.
Yeah. I mean, that's a different level of friendship that you're developing there for sure. I do want to just briefly touch on this because I want everybody to know that in 2015, there was actually a reunion at the prison camp in Weihsien, and you were able to attend that. What was it like going back to the camp? I know you were just a baby, so you didn't have any memories, but it was the place of your birth, and you had heard so many stories.
Well, it was interesting to go back because one of the things I was always told, do you know that camp had 22 births and 22 deaths? Something to remember about. So I was interested to go back and bring my daughters. And when we looked around the place, one of them said to me, "You didn't lie." I thought, pardon me? What do you mean I didn't lie? This is all true. This actually happened. And it's such an unbelievable thing because we could have been dead and we were supposed to be incinerated. So to go back to a place that we had actually managed to walk out of alive must have been, for those that were there and knew what was happening, it was fantastic. I was a stupid little baby who left camp and said, of all things, when everybody was out and saved in where it was, and I said turned around and I screamed, "I want to go home." And I got all the kids crying. They wanted to go home too.
Well, Molly, thanks so much for those stories. I mean, you're a great storyteller, and I wish we could continue talking. But you actually gave me a nice little segue. And Molly, thank you. We'll talk to you again in a little bit.
You're welcome.
You finished us up with the idea of the liberation of the camp. And next up, we're gonna pivot just ever so slightly and talk about the liberation of Weihsien. On August 17th in 1945, a rescue team of 6 Americans and 1 Chinese soldier liberated the camp under the Duck mission. Their B-24 bomber flew in low that morning, and the 7 men parachuted out, hiding in the nearby brush, unsure if they would be met by hostility from the Japanese captors. But the prisoners rushed out of the gates to greet them, cheering, singing, and hoisting them on their shoulders. The Japanese did not engage. That day, unforgettable to all who lived through it. For one former prisoner, Mary Previty, those rescuers, the heroes of her youth, stayed firmly in her mind as life carried on. She was determined to one day reunite with and thank them in person. Mary passed away suddenly in November of 2019, but she was able to fulfill her mission. And to share that story, I would like to welcome Helen Leavey, joining us today from York in Great Britain, a writer, journalist, and podcaster who had the privilege of connecting with Mary and writing about her journey in finding these World War II heroes. As a young journalist, Helen sought adventure and moved to China to work as a newspaper sub-editor. 18 months at the BBC in Taiwan followed, and a stint in London. She and her husband headed again to Beijing to study Mandarin for 1 year. They returned to Britain 7.5 years later, along with 2 children. Helen is also in the process of actually working on a screenplay about Weihsien. So thanks for being here with us today, Helen.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So if we can just jump right in, if you could just briefly tell us how you were first able to connect with Mary, and then jump right into her pursuit of tracking down these men.
So how I met Mary, it was 2015 and I was back in Britain, and up the road there's a town about an hour away from me called Barnsley, and the local government in Barnsley asked me to do a research report into a Victorian missionary called James Hudson Taylor, who'd left Yorkshire in the 1850s to go to China to spread Christianity. A long story short, he was Mary Previty's great-grandfather. So for my research into James Hudson Taylor, I was hooked up with Mary, and we were quickly emailing, and she was giving me all sorts of wonderful information about her ancestor. And she also told me about the Weihsien camp and directed me to Leopold's treasure trove of a website. And I was quickly hooked, as I think a lot of people are when they look at that website. So many great tales. Amongst our email chats at that time, so this was back in 2015, Mary told me she was coming to Barnsley for the 150th anniversary celebration of the founding of her great-grandfather's missionary organisation. So I was invited along with lots of other people, met Mary for the one and only time there on a rainy Yorkshire day, and she was 82 then, and I remember it the day very vividly. She was very little, immaculately dressed, makeup, pearl necklace. I seem to remember she had a black leather jacket on. I could be wrong about that, but that's how I recall her. And but mainly I remember that day for the chat I had with her, and I interviewed her for a newspaper article, and she was just very charismatic, razor sharp mind, and we had an interview then, and then we had tea and cakes with all the other people in the town hall, and that was the only time I actually met her. But we kept corresponding, and during our correspondence until she died last year, she told me lots of things about the day of the liberation and her search for her heroes. So shall I carry on into that now? Would you like me to talk about that?
Yes, please.
Okay. So just to give you a little bit more background, the search, by the time Mary started the search, it was actually 1997. So more than 50 years had gone by since the liberation. But if you, just to give it a little bit of context, if we just rewind back to 1945 for a second, Mary was 12 at that point, and I think like probably most of the people, or certainly most of the kids, and perhaps the ladies as well at the time in the camp, she had basically worshipped the ground that the liberators were walking on. And later on, she often referred to them to me as angels or heroes, and sometimes she even said they were gods. And you also have to remember at that point she'd been separated from her parents for 5.5 years, and she was only 12. So these men had a massive impact. They basically The war was over. They arrived at the camp, liberated the camp. The children were enchanted by these guys. You know, they wanted their autographs. They got them to sing to them. I mean, Mary said to me a couple of times, you know, we were in love with all of them. So finally freed, she and her siblings were reunited with their family, went to America. It was 1997. Mary's deciding that she really would like to move her search forward. She had the names of the men. She had a report that had been declassified, I think it was in 1985. But other than that, she didn't know really where to start. This is obviously kind of early internet days. So she was at a bit of a loose end. She was wondering, should she approach veterans groups or, you know, go to the Pentagon? She didn't really know. And then but at that point, she started campaigning for election to the New Jersey General Assembly. And her Senate partner, I think is how she described him, asked her to step in for him at a reunion banquet for a group of World War II veterans from the China, Burma, India, I think that's correct, Veterans Association. So there were going to be 70 or 80 people, men and women, veterans meeting. As it happened, about 10 minutes from Mary's home. So she was completely excited about this. She said, obviously hoping that some of the men, her heroes, would be there in person at the event. So she went along to the event, and she'd been asked to thank the ladies, the men and the ladies there for their service to America during World War II. So she did that. And then my understanding is she took a bit of a chance and just started telling them then the story of the liberation of Weihsien. So now I was lucky enough to meet Mary. She really could hold a room. She'd tell this story so much better. You know, it was her story. I'm just, you know, hopefully doing it a bit of justice. But the way she told the story, apparently there were people in the room crying. And then at the end of the story about Weihsien and the liberators, she read out the names of the 7 men and asked if any of them were in the room. And there was weeping and there was silence. Then, of course, none of the liberators were there. That would have been obviously far too easy. But and I would have ended my talk there. But Mary was soon being hugged by the men and the women, and they were asking her to write the story in their national magazine and offering their help to try and find these Weihsien liberators. Somebody at the event took a list of the 7 names, wrote them down, and not long afterwards, Mary received a big fat envelope in the mailbox of every name in America that matched the 7 names, with names, addresses, and phone numbers to help her in her search. And then the first lead came, I think, connected to the magazine article that Mary wrote. Now I'll have to refer a bit more to my notes here. A lady who read that article said her sister in Pennsylvania happened to live next door to one of the heroes who'd been the medic on the Liberation Day flight. And that was a gentleman called Raymond Hanchelak. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So Mary was really excited, and she made a phone call only to find out that Raymond had sadly died the year before. And she spoke to his widow, and they had a lovely conversation, but sadly no live hero. So Mary then carried on with the help of her big fat list, as she called it, pages and pages of names. She sent out some letters with self-addressed envelopes asking people, did you liberate the Weihsien camp in 1945? And I think she got a few notes back saying, no, but good luck, hope you find them. And she made a lot of phone calls, I think on Sunday evenings, because it was cheaper then to make long distance phone calls. And for Jim Moore, who was one of the liberators, it was particularly difficult because I think there was something like 150 Jim Moores on the list. So she was a bit concerned that, you know, would she have any luck finding the right one? So the second hero she found was a man called Peter Orlick, or rather, I should say, she found his widow, a lady called Carol, in New York City. And she told Mary that Peter had died 4 years, I think it was, before, at the age of 70. Back in 1945, he'd been the radio operator on Liberation Day, and he'd even taped his glasses to his head just before he jumped from the plane. So Mary was pleased to talk to Carol, his widow, and over the moon to be sent this piece of parachute. Carol sent her a piece of parachute that Peter had clung on to that had all the names of the 7 men autographed. They'd autographed this bit of parachute and he'd kept it for all those years. So that was 2 heroes found. Mary was now worried that she'd missed her chance to say thank you to any of her 7 heroes herself. She was thinking that, you know, possibly they'd all passed away. So she was getting concerned. And then back to the list, she looked at her list and saw the one and only name of a gentleman called Tad Nagaki. Now, he was the Japanese interpreter on the flight. So presumably crossing her fingers, she picked up the phone, called that number and said, "Can I speak to Tad Nagaki?" He said, "Speaking," and Mary began to cry. That was the first live hero that she found, and she was obviously delighted. Tad had moved back to Nebraska after the war and become a farmer, and he'd recently been widowed, and he was Mary's 3rd hero, and they struck up a friendship. And then Tad was able to hook Mary up with the 4th hero, Jim Moore. Tad had kept in touch with Jim Moore over the years, so Mary was lucky she didn't have to start going through all the 150 Jim Moores on the list. Jim was in Dallas, so she contacted him, number 4, as I said, and Jim told her, she was pretty amazed at this, I think. She was amazed to hear that he'd also been at the Chifu school in China, but years before Mary. And, so their paths hadn't actually crossed then. He'd left China in the 1930s and gone to America, gone to college, got married, had children, joined the FBI. But then he decided, you know, once Pearl Harbor happened, and then I think he heard about, later on he heard about his former Chifu school teachers and some of his classmates' siblings being interned. My understanding is that kind of got to him. He could have stayed in America with the FBI. He had the right to do so to protect the homeland, but he decided no, he was going to resign. He was going to go to war, and he joined the OSS, which is the forerunner of the CIA. And he was soon in China, and it's my understanding that he was handpicked for the Weihsien mission, which kind of made sense, him having been in China. He could speak some Chinese and what have you. So on Liberation Day, he was reunited with his teachers, including the headmaster. I quite like imagining, you know, the hug that they might have had as he strode in through the gates. And then fast forward to 1997, and Jim Moore was by then retired from the CIA. So he was very happy to help Mary find the other heroes, and she was quite funny. She said, I think I read this a couple of times, but she said that, you know, then she had a spy on her side helping her to find the last two heroes. So yeah, so perhaps with the help of a neighbour with a database, perhaps not entirely sure how Jim did it, but he rung Mary up to say he'd found Major Stanley Steiger, who was the head of the rescue mission, and Stanley was in Nevada, and he was elderly, obviously, and recovering from a broken hip. And Mary was very excited to find him. She remembered he'd taught her and some other children how to sing I think it was a popular ditty at the time, "You Are My Sunshine." So she was really pleased to speak to him, picked up the telephone and had a nice chat with Stanley Steiger. So that was number 5 that she found. So now there's just one more American name to find, and Jim Moore helped her out with that as well. It was a James Hannon. I think there was a few James Hannons that Jim had to go through, but he found the right one, hooked Mary up with him. So that was number 6. And James was amazing. He'd managed to actually escape from a German prisoner of war camp in Poland before he even got to Weihsien to help liberate it. So, you know, he must have been another amazing person. I think he wrote a book about that as well. So okay, so coming on to the last hero in a little bit, but just to rewind before I get to that bit, because Mary had trouble finding him. But in the meantime, she got to know the other 4 men and the 2 widows that she found. Lots of letters, lots of phone calls. They weren't able to all meet in a group reunion, but they did actually, she met them individually, and they kind of downplayed what they'd done, from what I've read and heard. but she, you know, she praised them to the nines and spoke to their friends and families and communities and churches and gave speeches and you know, told the local newspapers what a wonderful thing that they'd done, and, you know, put the heroes that were on her pedestal kind of out there for the world to enjoy. And then basically then, so, oh yeah, the one thing I just wanted to add there, yeah, she even actually telephoned, sorry, Jim Moore even telephoned her a few days before he died, just to say how she'd made his retirement even more interesting for him. So I thought
that's great.
I thought that was great. And so moving on to the seventh hero. So I don't know how much time I've got left. But,
brief.
Brief. Okay, so this was a great story, but basically Mary would never have found Eddie Wang Chung Han without the internet. She tried for years and went down a few dead ends, I think, but she'd more or less given up. And then she wrote an article in 2015 for the Weihsien website about finding her heroes, and mentioned that she couldn't find this last one, the Chinese interpreter on the flight. And then she suddenly got an email from a man called Daniel Wang, who turns out is Eddie's grandson. Daniel was in America. He said, "My grandfather's alive and well in China." Daniel basically hooked them up. And Mary asked lots of questions by email, first of all, just to clarify that this really was Eddie, the man that she'd been looking for or trying to find and hoping to find for 18 years by that point. And when Daniel assured her with all these lists of questions and answers that went back and forth, it really is Eddie. So she was convinced, made the phone call to Eddie. They had a lovely hour-long conversation, I think it was, with the help of a Chinese friend who helped to interpret and translate. And, you know, they talked about being back in Weihsien. They talked about Weihsien and Eddie learning to dance and accidentally smoking in the church and getting told off for it, and playing sport with the kids. And she found out what happened to him after the war. You know, he graduated, became an engineer. Unfortunately, he was locked up during the Cultural Revolution for just under 3 years, I think. And then the following year, 2016, Mary flew to China and met Eddie, and they chatted and they drank tea and ate food and spoke to reporters and sang and had a really great time together, I think, if you look at the photographs. And then they kept in touch regularly until Mary died last year, and Eddie did a little message for her funeral, which was read out. And so that was Mary successfully, you know, ended the search for her hero. She found them all, well, she found 5 heroes, 2 widows. Yeah. And she basically got to say thank you. That was the point of why she did it, I think, and she did it. So
yeah, I mean, I love that story. It's such a great testimony to Mary's spirit, and that brings us back to why we're here today, to just celebrate everyone who went through this, and to remember their stories. And you know, thank you for taking interest in these stories and shedding light on them and bringing them back to us. And we're all excited for what's to come from you as well.
Oh, I don't know when it will come, if it will come, but it's just so wonderful to be involved, and it's a pleasure to it's a pleasure to be involved. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Helen. Moving on, I do want to pivot slightly and bring us into the museum now, because that is why we are here. The Chinese American Museum in Washington, D.C. has put together a special exhibit for the Weihsien Prison Camp. But just to tell you a little bit about our museum, we're located just 4 blocks north of the White House in downtown Washington, D.C. in a beautiful Art Deco mansion, early 1900s. We're currently in the process of curating our permanent exhibits to open in phases throughout 2021. But instead of hearing me talk about the space, I do want to share a short video with you that was put together by Yujing Huang, who's a member of our team here at the museum. So bear with me one moment and I will give you that. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that very sneak peek. There's plenty more to come, but gave you a little idea of what we're doing over here in Washington, D.C. Just wanted to note as well that that overlay piece was actually played live here at one of our early receptions. And she was very willing to allow us to use it in that video. Thank you all very much. Next up, I want to introduce Rita Leavey. Sorry, one second. Rita Leavey is the museum's special exhibit curator of the Forgotten Stories from the Dao Yuan, the Weihsien Prison Camp in Shandong, China during World War II. In addition to her role at the museum, Rita is an active contributor to the Chinese Culture and Community Service Center in Maryland. She has been involved in the center for over 19 years, most recently serving as the director of the center's art gallery. Before retirement, Rita enjoyed a 30-year career as a copyright specialist from the U.S. Copyright Library of Congress. And with that, the mic is yours. Welcome, Rita.
Thank you, Louisa, for the introduction. It was a pleasure working on the exhibit and getting to know Leopold, Angela, Molly, Helen, and many others in the process. Thank you again, Leopold, for you letting me use your website as my primary resource for this exhibit. Well, due to the limited time, I'm going to jump to some images, some of the images. If you have time, this current exhibit is on view by appointment. If you have time, welcome to visit us. I include 66 images and 32 artist reproductions in the museum. You just saw it. It's okay, you know. So start the map, that one, yeah. Le Dao Yuan is about 20, let me see. Okay, let me say this. In the map, Louisa going to show is the map of the the map of the Weihsien located in Shandong, and Le Dao Yuan, the campsite, is about 250 kilometers away from Weihsien city. Let's see. Can you see it?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. This is the gate, city gate. Go into the Weihsien city. This is the Weihsien city. This is the front entrance to the camp. That's Le Dao Yuan, the front entrance. Let me see. Here is the map of the layout of the camp, okay? Well, you can see it's all a wall surrounded by the camp. This is the watchtower. All the red dots is the watchtower in this camp. The housing here, okay, let me quickly run through this. Okay, here is the missionary, Robert Mathieu, and his wife set up the boys and the girls schools in 1883 here. The early boys, and I didn't show the boy, this is the girls. And this growing slowly into a well-known Christian college in Shandong. This is the Chinese faculty in Western study for this college here. And also the missionary, they create this this is the early clinics here. And then they rebuilt the modern Shady-side hospital in 1924, okay. They were doctors also imprisoned in a camp. They turned the looted hospital and the lab were a crucial part of survival at the camp. Let me go to the next one. Okay, chief student, this is a main dormitory in Weihsien camp, and the chief student in their classroom. Chief student and the single people were placed in the basement of the hospital and in the classroom, teaching classroom. Let me see the next. Okay, this is a family housing, was previous Chinese dormitories. And this is a long row of the rooms, 9 by 12, that's a Leopold mentioned that, okay. Here is one of the important daily activity, that's the roll calls, twice daily, okay, 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. held in 6 different places in the camp. Well, Japanese order everyone to wear a handmade armband all the time, okay. And this is the kitchen. There were 3 kitchens in the camp. Kitchen 1, this is the painting done by the former Weihsien president. This is the kitchen 1. And that's, everyone has had a job there. They cook the feed, the whole camp, at least one point, 1,800 prisoners. So they were working very hard there. This is the music hall. That's Molly and Angela, they were mentioning about, this is Jacqueline's made the poster. They do have their own entertainment in the camp. And the basement is the dining hall. I see, it's the kitchen, not dining hall, number 3. And they also, Chief Wu offer a lot of activities for their students. This is Salvation Army Band practicing in front of the Japanese administrative building almost every day. Yeah. Well, here is the, I think Mary owned this original embroidery. I'm talking about, this is about the liberation, 7 liberator with their signature there. Okay, let's jump into here. The rescue team is a duck mission team member. This area, okay, Jing Hannon, okay, let's see. Mary found 5 of them. 2 of them passed away, and this is Eddie Wang. She met him in 2016, I believe. Okay, Jing Mo. I'm sorry, that's why. That's the Captain Stanley. Let's see. Okay, next one. Okay, that's the Liberation Day. They raised the American flag. This is on the bell tower of the block 23, I believe. It's a teaching building. Was the teaching building in the Dao Yuan. Here is the Liberation Day. You can see, I can find this, Leopold, right? Leopold was there, okay. And let's see, quickly run through this. There's after liberation, American bomber, and dropping a lot of food here, at the clothing, shoes. Okay, here after the liberation, of course, that they've been liberated, so they are allowed to go to the nearby Chinese market to get a fresh eggs and some vegetables. This is the drawing described by Aileen, right? Bazir, yeah, Bazir, yeah, right. Okay. And this is the last evacuation by plane. Okay, this is the early one because the railroad being destroyed, damaged, so they have to be evacuated by airplane. And I understand this one also is Leopold right here, Leopold, right? And your family member. Yeah, I read from your website. Okay, yeah, let's see it closely right here. Okay. Well, you saw that the R32 paintings we select due to the limited space at the museum. If you go to the Leopold's website, there are several artist map like this. Once you click the icon here, it will show the painting, where the painting, I mean, from the painting, you can sort of see the scenery, you know, actual scenery there, okay? And let me see a few here. Okay, this is the gate. This is from outside, the main entrance to Le Dao Yuan, to the camp. This is from the inside. And I found this, you know, very interesting. Is combining it's a fusion, cultural fusion at the Le Dao Yuan at the originally when they built those buildings. So you sort of can see in between house, the row 16 to 17 and 18 has a gate in between. This is the gate, the drawing. I found this drawing very interesting. This is the gate between this. This just like a Chinese courtyard house. So this is just like a courtyard house, okay? Okay, I'm just trying to show in here, the courtyard house. So if you come over to the library, you can see there's an open line, that's the gate, the entrance, go to several sections. Each section has a gate. That's the Chinese courtyard house. And this is the main street, the gate. You can see it's right here, the gate right here. Okay, let me run through. This is Jacqueline's painting, Leopold's family in this 22, block 22, this. Okay, this is the headquarter, Japanese headquarter right here. I'm going to run through this quickly.
This is fascinating.
Am I running out of time here? This is a black market. You can see the drawing here. And here, that's where this is a watercolor painting. That's the place right here. Children's playground. Okay, that's the watchtower loaded with the searching light and the gun point. Okay, I like to end up this. I found this is a very interesting sketch by Reverend and also teacher Hubbard. So I don't need to read this, but can you see it well? The Weihsien, the test. I do respect this group of people, and I also touched by this group of people here. So, and that's why I choose this painting end up as today's webinar show. And hope you can find some time to visit our museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Welcome back, everyone. So I hope that just gave you a little bit of an overview of the hard work that Rita was able to put in. And yeah, so we do have just a few minutes left. I don't want to keep you guys here all day. So I would just like to ask one or two questions. Leopold, if you would unmute yourself, I think we should hear from the webmaster. One question, how many people were in the camp?
We went maximum, we were at a moment 2,000 people in the camp. The number of people in the camp wasn't always the same amount. When the war ended, we were about 1,400. But during our stay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
During the 2.5 years we were in camp, there was movements of population. For example, at the beginning of the camp, all the priests and the religious people from Peking were in the camp. And there was an agreement between Japan and the Pope to let all those people go back to Peking. So that was about 500 people less. Then we had an evacuation. All that is written on the website, of course. An evacuation, about 400 people back to America. It was a prisoner exchange in accordance with the Western governments and America. And all those people went back to United States. And at that moment, all the Chifu kids came into camp. That was minus 400 plus 400. So the movement of population wasn't always at the same amount. When the war ended, we were about 1,400.
And the capacity was, you would say, over 2,000.
We were crammed in that small space.
Yeah.
There was a lot of people. All the paintings are marvelous because the painters didn't paint the people.
Yeah.
They painted the monuments, the trees, what was beautiful, but they weren't photographs.
Right. Well, and you know, it's amazing that there were artists like Jacqueline and many others who, that's the best kind of souvenir in my opinion. So.
Oh, absolutely. Jacqueline's paintings are marvelous.
And you know, with that, I think we are going to close it out. We are getting up to our 2:30 mark, and I don't want to keep anybody here too much longer. But I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. This is really special, and thank you all for joining us from all your different periods in the world. We have West Coast, Vancouver, Great Britain, Brussels with yourself, Leopold, and all of our viewers from all over the world too. So I would like to share one more screen with all of you. And this is just an encouragement to go and check out Leopold's website for yourself. It really is a vast depth of knowledge, stories, paintings, and these particular ones I put up are just kind of a little taste of what you'll find there. The two paintings on the right side of your screen are actually Jacqueline's, the top being the main gate and the bottom being one of the acting guilds that she put on and helped orchestrate during the time in camp. And then on the left side, you'll see, you know, I really like this cartoon because it shows the resilience of the prisoners. They, you know, times were hard and far from ideal, as you can see in this work, but they still made the most of it, were able to have a laugh and even do cartoons. So this is just a taste of what you'll find on the website and many other things as well. And all of this information will be put into an email for each of you who attended today, so you don't have to scramble to write this down. And thank you all very much for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of the day. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Everybody's welcome.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.